At 1:55 a.m., a single strike quietly changed the rules of strategic deterrence. Ukraine did not target a city, a frontline unit, or even a missile in flight. It targeted the system that allows nuclear threats to function. Kapustin Yar was not chosen for symbolism. It was chosen because without it, one of Russia's most feared weapons loses readiness, credibility, and timing. This was not escalation by firepower. It was escalation by logic. To understand why this moment matters, you have to look past the explosion and examine what broke behind it, and why that damage cannot be quickly repaired. At 2:40 a.m., Ukraine was not trying to shoot down Oreshnik. It was targeting what allowed Oreshnik to exist in the first place. Kapustin Yar is not just a testing range. It is the psychological backbone of Russia's nuclear deterrence doctrine, the place where the idea of readiness is constantly reinforced. Each year, the facility handles an estimated 14 to 18 missile preparation cycles. Every cycle lasts roughly 32 to 41 days, involving logistics, validation, and security procedures that cost $65 to $90 million per launch sequence. Without this process, Oreshnik is not a threat. It is a concept. The strike was never intended to flatten the site. Total destruction was unnecessary. The real objective was interruption, forcing delays, creating doubt, and establishing a dangerous precedent. Strategic weapons rely on continuity. Disrupt even a fraction of that chain, and confidence begins to erode. Once a system believed to be untouchable is shown to be vulnerable, even briefly, its credibility suffers. Protection costs rise, timelines stretch, hesitation replaces certainty. And when a deterrent weapon is no longer trusted as invincible, it has already begun to die long before it is physically destroyed. Kapustin Yar occupies a position that no other Russian military facility can fully replace. It is not a routine launch ground, nor simply a testing range. Within the Oreshnik deployment chain, it serves as the point where technology, personnel, and final authorization converge. This facility functions as the last gate before combat readiness. An estimated 62% of final component validation for Oreshnik-class systems can only be completed at Kapustin Yar. These procedures include system integration checks and pre-launch certifications that cannot be transferred to secondary locations. Without passing through this stage, the missile cannot be declared operational, regardless of its physical condition. The human factor deepens this dependency. Each year, roughly 1,100 to 1,300 technicians rotate through Kapustin Yar, yet fewer than 9% are cleared to oversee the full preparation sequence. That concentration of expertise creates a single point of failure. Any disruption, technical, procedural, or security-related, forces the process to halt. The consequences of error are severe. A minor procedural fault or data inconsistency can freeze a missile's authorization status for 6 to 12 months, as safety reviews and revalidation cycles restart from zero. In that time, Oreshnik is not delayed, it is unusable. Flamingo was not designed to win a traditional arms comparison. It was built to operate in the gray zone where existing rules fail. It is neither a standard cruise missile nor a disposable long-range drone, and that ambiguity is deliberate. Conventional air defense doctrine depends on classification. Targets are sorted, prioritized, and engaged based on familiar profiles. Flamingo disrupts that process. It does not fit ballistic models, and it does not behave like low-cost drones used for harassment. As a result, it avoids triggering the automatic strategic responses reserved for ballistic weapons while still carrying the destructive weight of a missile. This design choice defines its role. Flamingo is meant to strike post-launch infrastructure, not frontline targets. It targets facilities that support readiness, certification, and follow-on use. In other words, it attacks the system behind the weapon rather than the weapon in flight. Technically, Flamingo is optimized for this mission. Its effective strike range is estimated at 2,700 kilometers, allowing it to reach deep strategic locations. It maintains low-altitude flight, often below 120 meters, reducing radar exposure during the final approach. The payload is a multi-layer penetrating warhead of roughly 900 kilograms, sufficient to damage hardened structures rather than soft infrastructure. Cost is another critical factor. Each unit is estimated at approximately $7.5 million, making it several times cheaper than comparable Western cruise missiles. This allows repeated use without the economic penalty normally associated with deep strike weapons. Flamingo does not force an overwhelming response. It forces the wrong response, and that is precisely the point. At approximately 1:55 a.m. local time, the operation entered its decisive phase. What followed was not defined by the number of Flamingo weapons in the air, but by timing and approach. The strike was designed to apply decision pressure inside Russia's air defense network, not to overwhelm it with volume. Flamingo's flight paths forced defenders into a dilemma. Air defense commanders had to divide resources between two competing priorities: protecting the Kapustin Yar facility itself and maintaining coverage over the surrounding airspace. Focusing tightly on the installation created gaps along the approach corridors. Spreading coverage outward weakened protection over the facility. Either choice carried risk. The strain became visible almost immediately. Air defense systems were pushed to handle roughly 3 times their normal signal load, as real tracks mixed with decoys and ambiguous returns. This surge increased misclassification rates and delayed engagement decisions. In several sectors, batteries remained active for over 90 consecutive minutes, exceeding standard operational limits and raising the likelihood of operator fatigue and sensor degradation. Timing errors followed. Some units were forced into elevated alert states earlier than planned, while others reacted late. Overall response timelines showed deviations of approximately 14 to 19 minutes. In air defense operations, that margin is critical. It determines whether an interceptor meets a target or misses the engagement window entirely. This was never about defeating air defense head-on. It was about forcing choices under pressure. Once a strategic defense network starts choosing between bad options, the damage no longer stays in the air. It spreads into the system that sustains readiness itself. By 7:30 a.m. the following morning, the physical damage had already stopped mattering. The real impact began once standard procedures took over. Hangars can be repaired. Equipment can be replaced. What cannot be quickly restored is a broken process. After the strike, Russian authorities were forced to suspend routine operations and initiate full safety and security reviews. Every step linked to missile preparation had to be rechecked, not selectively, but from the beginning. That meant inspections, documentation audits, sensor recalibration, and internal investigations. In systems tied to strategic weapons, nothing moves forward until every question is closed. This is where the cost accumulates. Revalidation alone typically requires 4 to 6 months, even when damage is limited. The financial burden rises sharply during that period. Updated estimates place the combined cost of reassessment, reconstruction safeguards, and procedural compliance between $130 and $180 million. None of that spending increases capability. It only restores permission to operate. Personnel disruptions add another layer. Security protocols demand caution after any breach, resulting in the temporary removal or reassignment of experienced staff. In this case, an estimated 15 to 20% of key technical personnel were pulled from the process pending review. That loss of continuity slows progress even further. This is how modern strategic systems fail, not through dramatic destruction, but through enforced caution. The more complex the weapon, the more vulnerable it becomes to its own safety rules. From here on, the question is no longer about damage, but about whether Oreshnik can be relied upon to function on demand at all. Oreshnik did not lose its physical capabilities after the strike. Its speed, range, and destructive potential remain unchanged. What changed was its reliability. And in strategic warfare, reliability is what gives power meaning. A weapon designed for deterrence must be available on demand. That condition is no longer guaranteed. Current assessments suggest that Oreshnik's practical readiness rate has fallen to roughly 60 to 65%, well below the level required for consistent strategic signaling. Each interruption in the preparation cycle increases uncertainty about whether the system can be fielded when ordered. Delays carry consequences beyond scheduling. Every postponed deployment reduces confidence among planners and decision-makers. Analysts estimate that each failed or delayed readiness window erodes deterrent credibility by 10 to 12%. Over time, that loss compounds. A missile that exists but cannot be reliably activated stops shaping opponent behavior. As confidence drops, messaging fills the gap. Russia is forced to lean more heavily on verbal warnings and political statements to project strength. That shift is not a sign of control. It is compensation for a system that can no longer speak through action alone. This transition matters. Strategic weapons are meant to simplify decisions by removing doubt. When doubt returns, the weapon's purpose weakens. Oreshnik may still look formidable, but appearance does not deter. Usability does. From this point, attention moves outward. The impact of reduced reliability does not stop at Russia's internal planning. It reshapes how other actors interpret the balance of power. By 1:55 a.m. local time, the strike had already crossed a strategic threshold. What happened at Kapustin Yar was not viewed in isolation by Western planners. It immediately altered how risk was calculated beyond Ukraine's borders. The attack challenged an assumption NATO had long treated as stable, that certain Russian strategic facilities were effectively off-limits due to escalation concerns. Kapustin Yar proved that assumption was no longer absolute. Once that line was crossed, other sites had to be reassessed under the same logic. Within Flamingo's operational reach, analysts identify 10 to 13 Russian strategic facilities tied to missile forces, command support, or nuclear-related infrastructure. Importantly, roughly 30% of those locations are assessed to have weaker air defense coverage than Kapustin Yar. That imbalance matters. It expands the set of scenarios NATO must consider when evaluating escalation dynamics and deterrence stability. The psychological effect was immediate. Military planners understand that one successful strike against a protected strategic facility carries more influence than 3 failed attempts. It signals capability, intent, and learning, all at once. For NATO, ignoring that signal was not an option. The alliance did not need to respond militarily to recognize the shift. The perception of Russian invulnerability had been reduced, and perception drives planning. From this moment forward, the conversation moved beyond Ukraine's battlefield and into how strategic power is interpreted across Europe. At 1:55 a.m., the strike achieved more than a physical effect. It generated data. Every Flamingo that reached its target, and every one that was intercepted, fed information back into Ukraine's development cycle. In modern warfare, that feedback loop is as valuable as damage. Each interception reveals radar behavior, engagement timing, and operator response patterns. Each successful penetration confirms what worked and where defenses hesitated. Ukraine is not rushing this process. Flamingo is being refined deliberately, adjusted to match what Russian air defense actually does, not what doctrine claims it should do. The improvement cycle is measured. Updates are estimated to occur every 90 to 120 days, allowing engineers to integrate combat data methodically. With each iteration, analysts assess that penetration probability can increase by 12 to 15%. That change compounds quickly. Production matters as well. Current estimates suggest a potential output of 140 to 170 units per year if prioritized. That scale turns learning into sustained pressure. What makes Flamingo threatening is not what it did once, but what it will do next, armed with experience. After Kapustin Yar, Russia faced a strategic dilemma with no clean exit. Responding with nuclear force to a conventional strike would trigger near-total isolation. Failing to respond would weaken the credibility of future threats. Either option carried long-term cost. The financial burden is already visible. Analysts estimate that reinforcing and restructuring protection across Russia's strategic infrastructure could require $8 to $12 billion over the next several years. That spending does not expand capability. It only attempts to restore lost confidence. At the same time, every delayed or canceled readiness cycle reduces the bargaining value of nuclear signaling and diplomacy. Ukraine did not need a decisive battlefield victory to cause this shift. It only needed to introduce uncertainty. Once doubt enters a deterrence system, planners must assume worst-case scenarios. That assumption drives overinvestment, slower decision-making, and reduced flexibility. For Europe, the lesson was clear. Russia still possesses nuclear weapons, but its ability to use them as unquestioned leverage is no longer absolute. When deterrence becomes conditional, strategic power changes shape. What happened at Kapustin Yar was not just another strike in a long war. It marked a shift in how power, deterrence, and risk are calculated in modern conflict. Ukraine showed that even the most intimidating weapons depend on fragile systems behind the scenes. and those systems can be challenged. From that point on, nuclear threats stopped being absolute and started being conditional. That change matters far beyond one battlefield. If you found this analysis useful and want clear, no-nonsense breakdowns like this, please hit the like button. It helps the channel more than you might think. Subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with our latest military and strategic coverage.